Hello, 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 Slayer heads. Welcome back to Slay to Z, a tribute to the entire song catalog of one of the greatest bands of all time, Slayer, where every episode, as usual, we aim to pick, slice, and dissect all things Slayer. Today we're exploring the depths of 1985's Hell Awaits record, and specifically the blood-sucking epic, At Dawn They Sleep. We have Jeff Hanneman to thank for the music of At Dawn They Sleep, and in a fairly unusual arrangement, a group effort on the lyrics between King, Hanneman, and Araya. More on this shortly. At Dawn They Sleep is the third track on Hell Awaits, and closes out side 1 on vinyl pressings. The song was Slayer's second longest track by this point in their career, coming in at 6 minutes 17 seconds, and is one of the 3 songs on Hell Awaits that is over 6 minutes. The progressive overtones of Hell Awaits, including the long and more complex song arrangements, were certainly foreshadowed on the Haunting the Chapel EP released the year before, and which found the band expanding a little bit beyond the pretty rote song structures demonstrated on Show No Mercy. Again, they were a baby band, so they were still kind of figuring it out. That increasingly progressive and atmospheric tone on display was an obvious nod, in my opinion, to Merciful Fate, whom Carrie and Jeff have both acknowledged being quote-unquote very into around the time of writing Hell Awaits. And while it sounds like the same band still, the evolution from Show No Mercy to Hell Awaits is quite significant. So let's lift the lid of terror and feel the deadly cold of At Dawn They Sleep freeze us from inside. Okay, sorry, no more puns this time. Go ahead, raise the stake in malice, just don't plunge it down. Shit. Let's talk tone. The entire album's standout sonic feature, for better or worse, is the dense layer of reverb applied to basically every aspect of the recording. But for all the wetness of massive reverb, the guitars are undeniably beefier than they were on the previous album. Nowhere is this more evident than the breakdown that starts around the 3-minute mark. At Dawn They Sleep is already a mostly mid-paced song, but when the breakdown comes, the band dips down another 30-ish beats per minute to around 150 BPM that, in this case, feels downright sludgy by Slayer standards. It adds a great kind of creeping atmosphere to the song that fits with those ominous lyrics. And I feel like in metal, guitar tones can kind of easily break down in those crazy fast and mid to slow tempos. And it would have been easy for Carrie and Jeff to have their rhythm tones dialed in for that, typical tremolo picking and those speedy hardcore punk kind of inspired power chord sections, but not have spent time developing a big sound that resonates when playing these kind of chunkier, more open parts at those slower tempos. But this doesn't really seem to be the case, as the quality of the guitar tones is pretty damn consistent throughout the whole song, and indeed the whole album. Compositionally, like the title track for the album, At Dawn They Sleep represents a significant step forward from Show No Mercy and Haunting the Chapel. There's a strong musical theme or motif that runs throughout. Variations on that theme are heard in that harmonized intro, as well as during the breakdown as it begins to kind of build tension in the instrumental break between verses before, kind of at the 4.5 minutes in, Hanneman just hits us with a brand new riff that takes the listener back up over 200 BPMs, but still fits perfectly with the overall musical motif. Like much of Hell Awaits, the song is packed with riffs and time changes. And just kind of coming back around, how about that harmonized intro riff? And that nasty harmony bit in the bridge leading up to that kill part. Now we're really hearing those true Slayer trademarks starting to take shape. Those incredible evil-sounding chromatic parts that no one does quite like Jeff Hanneman and Kerry King did. All right, because this is the first time we're talking about this album, I have to bring up the bass. Unironically, I love it. This has to be the clearest Tom's bass ever was in an album mix. It is incredibly prominent and doesn't seem to be battling the guitars in the frequency spectrum hardly at all, which is often a challenge or a problem, especially with thrash metal, because the guitar tones tend to be very, very scooped, which leaves only the highs and the lows. And the lows, of course, are going to eat up or take up in battle frequencies with the bass. So, similar to what we covered on the Antichrist episode, that bass tone is still pretty flat overall. And at times it sounds almost closer to like a dampened piano or something rather than a bass guitar. But it has clarity going for it. It would seem that this was still in an era, second album, when Tom was actually recording his bass parts himself instead of Kerry or Jeff. And if we're operating under that assumption, then it must be said that his performance is fairly impressive. The bass lines largely mimic the guitars, but there are several little runs where he's hanging with Jeff and Kerry like note for note. For instance, the riff leading into the drum solo, where the bass is absolutely standing ground with the guitars. That you can hear Tom hanging right there neck and neck with him. I can't think of another Slayer record that features Tom playing his ass off like he is on Hell Awaits. Again, it's not virtuosic stuff, but it's a welcome flavor for sure. And kind of missed, honestly, later on when the bass would be just relegated to just kind of this low frequency rumble unless there was a breakout part where the guitar is completely dropped. As far as guitar solos, there are 3 spread out through the track. Now, Kerry King takes the first lead, and it's kind of quintessential atonal Slayer squall, with Kerry really leaning in a bit on his right hand tapping technique, and especially like these descending tapping runs. It's nothing explosive, but it fits the track well enough, and it's kind of cool. I always like watching Kerry playing those things live like this. And like I said, doing his descending tapping thing that he's kind of made into like a little bit of a trademark of his, similar to his whammy bar stuff. He's got kind of a unique tapping style. As a guitar player, I always found that kind of interesting. Henneman's first lead follows King's, and it's actually adds a bit of atmosphere to the kind of slushy mid-tempo stew. And the added chorusing on Jeff's guitar only serves to thicken the creeping vibe that I mentioned earlier. It serves to kind of thicken that vibe a bit more. It's not his greatest moment, but it's a solid addition nonetheless. Jeff also takes the final lead towards the end of the song. And this solo is more of an up-tempo and typically kind of Slayer-ish. You can definitely tell it's a little bit more improv, less structured than Jeff's first solo during the breakdown. But otherwise, it's, this last solo is short and not massively noteworthy, but it does serve as a sort of a crescendo kind of building to that drum break, right? So, yeah, overall, not bad. In the lead department, it'll work. It's serviceable. It's Slayer. Speaking of drums, one of the highlights of Dave Lombardo's performance on At Dawn They Sleep is the creativity of his playing. Every choice he makes is so musical, as opposed to the trap that I think a lot of those early metal and thrash drummers would fall into of keep time, but you're just kind of bashing away on the skank beat, do a big fill, and keep hammering on that skank beat, big fill, and maybe a skank beat with a double time kick drum to add to the sense of urgency, etc., rinse and repeat. Dave instead keeps things interesting throughout and largely avoids leaning too heavily on those tropes because his drum vocabulary is already so developed by 1985, just the second album in. Whenever I say drum vocabulary, I mean so many drummers, whenever they're doing just kind of standard parts, during verses and choruses and stuff, instead of just the fills, they're not thinking of using tom-toms. just randomly throwing Tom hits and stuff in unless they're doing big fills. Dave was definitely not doing that. He was dropping an occasional tom or two on the upbeats and things like that. I mean, it's really, really interesting stuff, compositionally speaking. When asked about Dave Lombardo's drumming on this song, I reckon most people probably most remember the big drum break just before the outro of the song, which the outro is actually the intro played over again. Anyways, the drum part is a big, bombastic double bass and tom-tom solo that lasts for, in my opinion, a pretty surprising 7 or 8 unaccompanied seconds, which feels really long whenever you're listening to it. Any other drummer in the genre at this time trying to pull this off would either fail to make it interesting or possibly come across as self-indulgent or arrogant, or all of the above. But Lombardo somehow pulls it off. It's hard for me to say if it really adds anything to the song, but it is certainly a spotlight moment, and it definitely doesn't take anything away. Of course, the band would use a similar arrangement trick to great effect on the next album, Rain and Blood, with the big double bass break, famously an Angel of Death. Again, if you're going to do it, at least you can count on Dave Lombardo's capable hands and feet. Lyrically, the song deals with vampires, and while there are not necessarily any specific references to what type or era of vampire, to myself, it kind of reads with this Victorian flair, as opposed to, say, I don't know, some like ridiculous sparkling vampire bullshit, or daywalkers, or the particularly nasty types that look like they just kind of crawled up from the shores of hell or out of the grave. Even though that is mentioned in the track, it doesn't really bring to mind that mental image. Many of the classic traits of literary vampirism are referenced throughout the song. Nocturnal existence, an aversion to light, vampiric lust, resting in the coffin, the severity of a wooden stake impaling the creature, the telepathic abilities, immortality, and more specifically imbuing their victims with the curse of immortality, the repellent effect of the crucifix, flight, possibly in bat form, and of course an unquenchable thirst for blood. But there's also an almost strange elegance and even romance to it all. At Dawn They Sleep walks an interesting balance between edgy goth poetry and solidly creative metal lyrics. The fact that 3 out of 4 members of the band contributed to these lyrics probably also accounts for the relatively unique thematic tone and rhythm and cadence. It's also somewhat different in the fact that there's no single protagonist identified in the lyrics. Rather, there seems to be a clan of the parasites. This fact is emphasized by the gang backup chants of "kill" during the breakdown. It's actually really creative stuff. As for the vocals, Tom's performance on this recording is generally very solid. I think it's a glimpse into where his vocal approach would eventually evolve to. There are no falsetto screams to be found. Instead, he stays in the lower end of his range for most of the song, and there's a great guttural aria scream coming out of the middle or interlude bit where we get more of a taste of his vocal power as he screams, "Kill!" And as an aside, the first time I ever heard this song was actually on the live video from the Divine Intervention era called Live Intrusion. The band played the song pretty true to album tempo, and they were really tight. But interestingly, they extended the middle bit, which gave Tom time to really kind of whip the crowd into even more of a frenzy just by singing calmly but confidently, "Kill, kill, kill, kill." This goes on, I think, about 16 times, with Tom just gradually building intensity in his delivery with each turn until reaching that big climatic scream that I talked about a minute ago. The almost commanding nature of this bit, I can only imagine had people in the crowd building further towards that frenzy. It also, I should say personally, did nothing to alleviate the reservations in my 14-year-old kid brain that Slayer might actually be a conduit to the devil himself. In short, it was a rad addition to the live setting. Maybe even more so because Slayer is a band that somewhat notoriously does not improvise or stray much, if at all, from the classic recorded arrangements of their songs. So before we rank, I just want to say that while it's not my favorite track on Hell Awaits, At Dawn They Sleep is probably the song that most fully got me into the album. The reason I say this is because I love the original recorded version of the song far more than any live version I've ever heard. Whereas, and I won't say what yet, I don't want to spoil it, but my personal favorite track on the album that we'll talk about later excels in the live setting much more, in my opinion, than here on the 1985 original recording. I hope that makes sense. Anyways, all that to say, At Dawn They Sleep is definitely a gold star moment in the catalog. For that reason, I'm going to rank it at, let's go with number 2. Just behind Angel of Death and just a hair above Altar of Sacrifice. Look, At Dawn They Sleep is an undeniable high point in Slayer's catalog, and I imagine that many fans would argue it is the best song on Hell Awaits. But I just kind of feel like it's going to take a little more muscle to dethrone Angel of Death from that top spot. So on our next episode, we're going to fast forward and jump into our first song from Slayer's final album, 2015's Repentless. The track is Atrocity Vendor, and I'm actually really interested in spinning this one to see how it has held up since its original release. I have to be honest, Repentless ranks near the bottom of the list of Slayer albums for me personally, but I still look forward to listening to it with fresh ears and after a good bit of time. Hey man, I'm open to surprises. Please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're hearing this. If you want to drop a line to the show directly to give me a pat on the back for my efforts, correct me, or tell me why you think At Dawn They Sleep is actually a better song than Angel of Death, I am always happy to read your messages at slaytozpod@gmail.com. slaytozpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and as always, remember.